once you have your machine threaded, then you're ready to sew. And when you join two pieces of fabric together, it's called a seam. So I'm going to show you now how to do a plain seam, which is the most basic seam you can use. So I'm going to take my two pieces of fabric, I'm going to place them right sides together. So this is the right side of the fabric, the side that you want to see, and this is the wrong side. So we're going to start off with them right sides together. So I'm making sure the edges are completely aligned, and I'm going to sew a 15mm plain seam. So I'm going to put my fabric in the machine, line my edge up with the 15mm seam guide, pushing back a little of the fabric behind the needle. So immediately I'm going to start sewing. I'm going to start with my finger on the reverse lever. So I'm going to do about 3 reinforcement stitches backwards, then I'm going to come forwards and complete the seam to the bottom of my fabric. Then I did some reverse stitches at the bottom, again to reinforce the threads. So I'll cut my thread, and that is my plain seam. Now what we have to do is to prevent the edges of the fabric fraying. So there are various ways of doing that. The easiest with a domestic machine is to do a zigzag stitch. So I'm going to turn my machine selection to zigzag. I also like to turn the stitch length down to about somewhere between 1 and 1.5mm, which means my stitches will be much closer together. And I'm going to sew, just starting with a zigzag. Now I want my needle to be off the edge of the fabric, so that it's going to be wrapping the fabric edge with stitches. So there we have a neat fabric edge. There's going to be no further fraying, and that's going to be a strong, stable seam in whatever I'm going to use it for. You'll note that I have edged or I've stitched the two sides of my fabric together. It is possible to neaten each seam allowance separately and press the seams open and flat if you wanted to for a thicker fabric. So now I'm going to go and give this a press. So first of all, a quick press exactly as the seam comes out the machine, and this is called melding. And what this does is it allows the steam to penetrate into the fabric, and the thread will sink down into the fabric and become one with it. And tailors call this melding, and that allows the seam in your fabric to lie completely flat. Then I'm going to open it up and press these seam allowances to one side. So I want to have the seam nice and flat, so I'm going to exert a little bit gentle pressure on the fabric whilst pushing that seam open with the toe and the side of the iron. So you want your seam to be lying completely flat. And this is something you would do before you move on to the next stage, before you attach something else onto this piece of work. Okay, so there, the melding process has enabled me to achieve a very flat, crisp seam. If you don't want to press your seam allowances together and to edge them together, you could do them separately, press them open. Here I have another plain seam, which from the front it looks exactly the same, albeit on plain fabric, on calico, not cotton fabric. When we turn it over, you see I've neatened each edge separately with my zigzag and pressed the two flat or open. So the choice whether you do one or the other would depend mainly on the kind of fabric you're using. If you're using very thick fabric, you wouldn't want to do this because it would create quite a ridge. If you're using thinner fabric, this is fine. If you were using thicker fabric, this might be more suitable. So maybe tweed or wool coatings. That is your plain seam. You can leave the seam exactly as it is, just with the neatening stitches to prevent it fraying, or you could go on to decorate it and reinforce it to make it stronger. So you can do this in several ways. First is edge stitching, which is a form of top stitching because it's done from the top, from the front side. So, but edge stitching is done when it's very close to an edge or a previous seam. So in this one, this is edge stitched from the front. This one, the stitching is a little bit further in. This is top stitched. And this one has both. So it's edge stitched and it's top stitched. So not only does this help reinforce the seam and make it stronger, but it also helps your seam allowances lie flat. And it also gives your garment a bit of detail. So if you want to add a bit of personalisation or to enhance the seams in a garment, which is made from panels, you can do it with top stitching. So I'm going to show you how to do it straight. If you can't do it straight, don't do it at all. So again, as for sewing a seam, it's the same principle. You need to have a visual reference to guide you. So on this foot here, I have these useful little notches. So for edge stitching, I use the one right on the inside. For top stitching, I have a couple of other choices. If you don't have a foot that's shaped like that, a zip foot is quite helpful. So what a zip foot will do, here's a zip foot here. So a zip foot has notches taken from either side, and it will sit on your seam. So you can use the edge of the foot as your guide, and the needle will be very close to your previous seam. So I'm going to line up my first seam with the inner notch on the foot, and as long as I guide the seam along that notch of the foot, I'll get some straight parallel stitching to my seam. So there's my edge stitching. Quite pleased with that. And I'm going to go back in and do another row. So this time I'm going to use the edge of my presser foot. I'm going to line it up again and do some reinforcement stitches this time. just letting the pressure foot run down the edge of my previous seam. So there is my top stitched seam. So this is starting to look like the seam that you would find on jeans, which is called a flat fell seam. But because this isn't the traditional method to do a flat fell seam, this has become known as a mock flat fell seam. And it's neatened with our zigzagging, and the seam allowances are stitched down and secure. So this is a very strong seam, it's going to lie flat, and it's also providing some detail for the garment. So a plain seam is the most basic, most useful, most common method of joining two pieces of fabric, and you could just leave it the way it is. However, there are a number of other ways of doing it. One of the other most useful ways to know is a French seam, and this is specifically for lighter weight fabrics, whereas a plain seam is good for all kinds of fabrics from very light to very heavy. A French seam is used often on very slippery fabrics which tend to fray, or things like crepe de chine, very lightweight blouse fabrics, lingerie. And it starts with sewing your fabric wrong sides together. So it's going to be stitched twice. So we're going to start wrong sides together. Now, a French seam is a couture technique, and in couture it would never be more than 5mm. And because it's double stitched, we need to take our seam allowance and divide that between 2. So if you're aiming for a 5mm finish, we're going to use the couture technique. That gives you 10mm for the first part of the seam. So I'm going to begin by stitching my fabric together using my 10mm mark. Doesn't matter whether you reinforce your stitches at the beginning here or not, it's going to be stitched again. So as long as you do them the second time, but I do anyway. So that's the first part of my seam with a 1cm seam allowance. And now we're going to compress and trim that. So a quick press. Again, I'm melting my seam. It's flattening out the fabric, letting the thread integrate with the fabric. Now I'm going to trim the seam allowances. I'm going to trim them back quite severely. So I'm looking to leave about 3mm. So I'm taking off actually about 2/3 of my seam. I'm going to trim it all the way up. Then I'm going to open this out, press the seam allowances to one side. I want to open this seam. So you need to be careful not to pull too tightly on your fabric because you could burst it. So that's that seam nice and open. Doesn't really matter what's happening with these seam allowances. This is going a bit. So parted company here. Not too bothered about that. Because now I'm going to fold in half. Just use your fingertips to manipulate the seam so that the edge, your seam is lying right on the folded edge. Again, use your fingertips just to roll and press, roll and press. So I'm still working from the wrong side of my fabric. The right side is inside. Okay, so now it's ready for the second set of stitching. So my second part of a French seam, to finalise it, is going to be 5mm. So remember, we've already used 10. We have a 15mm seam allowance in our pattern. So now we're going to use the final 5mm for the second stage. So 5mm is quite difficult to sew. It's usually somewhere just in front of the right feed dog. And you will find it's like rowing a boat with one oar. When you only have one feed dog pulling the fabric through, it wants to tend to twist. So you need to be careful to control that. This is the seam that's going to take all the strain, so this is why I want to do some reverse stitches on this one now. So I've created a little channel here, which is hopefully going to lock those raw edges away, so we won't see them. And when we open up, yay! And that's the French seam. So it's a very neat seam. We don't see any ragged raw edges. It's quite strong. And it's excellent for lightweight fabric, so blouses, especially when they're made of chiffon or silk, which have a tendency to fray. So I'm just going to go and give that a final press. So my final press of the French seam is firstly again to meld in your second set of stitches. Then we're going to open up to the right side of the fabric and just press that seam open, like so. So from the front you wouldn't really know what was going on. You may think it was a plain seam, but on the back we have no ragged raw edges. You don't see any zigzagging or overlocking, just this little channel which locks away all your frayed edges. So a French seam is very good for fabric which is prone to fraying. So your sort of crepe de chines, chiffons, silks, georgettes, organzas, or even indeed skirt lining fabric. So French seam is a lovely seam for ladies wear and lingerie. The third and final seam is a flat fell seam, and this is a traditional seam used for jeans, particularly on the inside leg. It's because it lies very flat. It's also very strong and hard wearing. So flat fell seams are often found on workwear such as dungarees and overalls. Because it's flat, it's often found on pyjamas, children's clothing, and on men's shirts, or ladies' shirts as well for that matter. So the first stage to a flat fell seam is, again, the initial seam is done on the right side of the fabric. So have your right sides facing out. Now I like to use 20mm for my seam. If you're using a very thick fabric, like a very bulky denim, it's good to use 20mm because it allows you a little bit more fabric to fold. I'm going to use this on 15. Obviously, if you did want to use 20, you would need to make an allowance for that when you're cutting out your garment pieces. So 15, I'm going to do some reinforcement stitches at the beginning. Okay, so now to iron, of course. Okay, first stage, melding. Then I'm going to trim back one of my seam allowances. Okay, not both of them this time, just the one. And I want to trim it back to slightly less than half of its previous width. So there we go, just under half. Now I'm going to take my fabric and open the seam out. I'm going to press the wider seam allowance over the narrower one. And again, using the side of the iron to push seam allowances to lie flat towards one side. So I run the edge of the iron along the seam. That's forcing the seam open. See how it's lying nice and flat. You can give it a press on the other side if you wish. So doing it from the other side, I'm holding this seam open, and there we go, it's opened out completely, flat and smooth. So this is what we're looking for. Now I like to work upside down because I'm going to use my fingertips to fold the wider seam allowance in and tuck it down. So you just push it back as far as it will go. And press. This is where you have to be careful not to scald your fingers. And if you're pushing it back all the way, i.e. as far as it will go, you should automatically get a nice straight line along here. If you're only turning under a little, you may have to measure. So if you're looking for a wider flat fell seam result, then you should definitely just use a 2cm seam allowance, which will make this process much easier. So if you use 1.5, it does end up quite a narrow seam. Right, now that is fairly neatly pressed, it's not perfect. Now, second stage is to stitch this down along this edge, so this is more edge stitching. Right, I'm just preparing to edge stitch this flap down to complete my flat fell seam. Just like to point out, because I am actually using a different coloured bobbin thread for demonstration purposes, what you're seeing here is the bobbin thread, and I've got a darker thread on the top, so I will get unevenly coloured threads. If you're using matching thread top and bottom, your seam will look exactly the same, as it should. So I'm lining up. I want to reinforce the beginning and end of my seam, so reverse stitching. Again, I'm using my edge stitching guide to give me a close stitch. And that's my flat fell seam. So the beauty of a flat fell seam and a French seam is that you don't have any ragged seam allowances on the back, and indeed a flat fell seam is actually, you could use it on either side. It looks quite good from the back too. And see, the row edges are enclosed inside, so there's no need for zigzagging or overlocking. Likewise the French seam. So that's why I think they're both two of my favourite seams, and I like to incorporate them into garments when I can. They also give a more professional finish than just doing a plain seam.